a todos, que tiene trascendencia nacional, que tiene que ver con las coyunturas nacionales, tiene que ver con las coyunturas regionales y también tiene que ver con coyunturas globales. También tiene que ver con diferentes estadios en la historia del desarrollo de los derechos humanos y también de la protección internacional de los derechos humanos. Desde América Latina nosotros siempre hemos demostrado, sobre todo desde el siglo XIX, como muy jóvenes estados en formación, el interés en el fuerte desarrollo del derecho internacional como ámbito multilateral e igualador, dada nuestra situación de desigualdad con muchos otros actores y muchos otros poderes a nivel global. América Latina tiene una larga historia en este sentido, de apoyar el desarrollo del derecho internacional. Y también, a partir del siglo XX, de apoyar el desarrollo de la protección internacional de los derechos humanos. Hay una corriente muy interesante que estudia el impacto y la influencia de los estados de América Latina, por ejemplo, en el texto de la Carta de Naciones Unidas, la inclusión de los derechos humanos como parte de los principios de Naciones Unidas, que fue fuertemente impulsada por los estados latinoamericanos, que eran 20 de los 50 estados que participaron de la Conferencia de San Francisco, y además de la influencia que tuvieron muchos de estos estados en el texto de la Declaración Universal de Derechos Humanos. Estos estados venían de trabajar en la producción de la Declaración Americana de Derechos Humanos, y muchos de los borradores que produjeron, especialmente los borradores de Chile y de Panamá, fueron muchos de los textos que finalmente se vieron reflejados en la versión final de la Declaración Universal, que este año cumple 70 años como la Declaración Americana. Entonces, estamos en una región en la cual se ha acompañado el desarrollo del derecho internacional y también la protección internacional de los derechos humanos, con una perspectiva bastante idealista sobre el impacto que eso podía tener en las relaciones internacionales. Estamos en otro momento, después de un momento de gran auge del desarrollo, sobre todo de la protección internacional de los derechos humanos, durante la década de los 80, durante la década de los 90 sobre todo. George seguramente va a hablar mucho de la conferencia de Viena del 93, que tuvo un impacto tan importante en la resignificación de los derechos humanos. Después de ese momento de gran fortalecimiento de la protección internacional y de ratificación de muchos tratados internacionales, hay muchos que argumentan que estamos en un momento de fatiga, en la relación conceptual, diría incluso, con el tema de los derechos humanos. Más allá de eso, de esas opiniones, corresponde que nos preguntemos seriamente sobre estas herramientas que hemos desarrollado durante todas estas décadas y en qué medida son las herramientas que nos ayudarán a superar los problemas que nos aquejan en particular en nuestra región, que son los problemas de la desigualdad y muchos de la desigualdad económica. Entonces tenemos herramientas legales, tenemos un corpus jurídico, muchos dicen que es un corpus que responde a una filosofía liberal, que uno puede decir que culturalmente es afín o no a lo que debiera ser el espíritu de los pueblos del continente, pero que está ligado a nuestra historia, definitivamente ligado a nuestra historia. La pregunta que tenemos es, ¿en qué medida estas herramientas llevan a la universalidad de los derechos humanos y en qué medida nos sirven para resolver los problemas de la desigualdad que aquejan en particular a nuestro continente? Estas son algunas de las preguntas que se nos ocurren a todos. Y creo que George, con su sagacidad, con su experiencia, nos puede ayudar en estos minutos, en los 40 minutos que siguen, a comprender mejor las aristas de estos problemas. Así que le doy la palabra directamente.
Thank you, Veronica. I would like to thank all of you for welcoming me here in Buenos Aires. It's really a pleasure to be here. So to be here at the end of your teaching program in this academic year, and to be in the company also of many fellow human rights educators and contributors to the LATMA program. I have to say that we have a great mutual benefit of our partnership in the global campus context, and we've had great benefits from Veronica Gomez's lectures in Venice, and I'm very happy to be here, both to share some thoughts, but also to come to know you better and to understand your program better. I'd like to start by apologizing that I'm not fluent in Spanish, so you'll have to put up with my English and the mediation of a translator. So having made these few nice introductory remarks, I'll start my presentation with a voice of complaint. You have given me a very difficult task, Veronica, in the sense that I'm presenting a seminar for this year's students, and we're halfway through it. And now we have an open presentation on the same topic, which is both supposed to continue the seminar of the afternoon and start over again and be new and fresh and different. So I was struggling with how to both integrate what we're doing here with the initial class in the afternoon and yet have a distinct and self-contained focus of the presentation here. And I hope the formula works. We'll see if it works. So just to remind the other colleagues in the audience, the focus of the seminar today and on Monday is about identifying and seeking constructive engagement with different expressions of skepticism about human rights, uncertainty, criticism about the international human rights framework, and various open questions in this regard. I don't want to go into a lot of detail with what we've covered so far, but just to point out that I've presented a taxonomy with four main expressions, of four levels of skepticism about human rights that I call ontological, cultural, religion-based skepticism, pragmatic skepticism, and political skepticism. At the ontological level, it's a question about whether human rights exist. Are they real? Are they meaningful? How do we conceptualize human rights? Cultural and religious-based skepticism point to potential discrepancies between the universal human rights framework and local beliefs and practices in many of the contexts and settings in which human rights are being operationalized. It's a mode of skepticism that very often points to the so-called Western bias or European bias of the human rights framework and questions whether that is legitimate as a policy reference for international relations in the contemporary world. Pragmatic skepticism doesn't question the concept or the values contained in human rights so much as whether they're realistic to operationalize in practice and whether it's feasible to reconcile security objectives or economic development objectives with agreed international human rights standards. Finally, political skepticism is articulated in a number of different forms. In a European context, there's a lot of focus on whether there's an imbalance between the authority given to elected representatives of the public, to parliamentarians, on the one hand, and to non-elected human rights experts, judges, and others who seem to interfere unduly sometimes with political processes without the type of accountability that elected representatives of the public are subject to. Another expression of political skepticism was to some of the questions, Veronica, that you were also addressing from the outset here, the potential and potentially uncomfortable coexistence between an ascendant global human rights paradigm in the era since World War II, and to a certain extent the era since the end of the Cold War on the one side, and the rapid development of a capitalist and to some extent neoliberalistic economy, which in the current era is generating advances in overall wealth, but also polarization between different segments of the world and different segments of society's populations, so that the gap between rich and poor is in fact increasing despite increased economic development. And this gives rise to further questions about whether it might be that some of the promises contained in the human rights framework require more radical political transformation to be truly realized. This would be a neo-Marxist skepticism and critique about human rights, that the promises themselves, the ideals, the visions of equality, safeguarding human dignity and so on, are absolutely legitimate, but not realistic to attain in a world governed by the existing economic structures. And this raises questions in turn about whether we can maintain actually the premise of so-called political neutrality of human rights. Human rights is a paradigm that should be accepted and embraced across the legitimate political spectrum, or whether in fact the time has come in certain ways to repoliticize the concept of human rights and see human rights also as an instrument of struggle against social injustice and oppression. In some of the more difficult expressions of political skepticism, there are of course scholars who ask whether there's a complicity between the human rights paradigm that's widely embraced by international organizations and an interest in maintaining and preserving a status quo. The critical South Asian legal philosopher Rajagopal has pointed out that in the contemporary era, human rights idiom establishes a monopoly on legitimate resistance to governance is only legitimate if the objections or critiques are framed in a human rights paradigm, and he says that may in a certain way delegitimize various social movements and forms of resistance that come from below and that in many ways seek to challenge and address social inequality and injustice. So the question is, are we against our intention and will somehow being complicitous in maintaining an order that also generates and perpetuates social inequalities to an extent that is in some ways unprecedented? Now I'm raising all of these questions and in terms of the seminar, we're going to continue examining some of these questions on Monday when we pick up the thread again. We're now going to somehow take a little deviation and look at the same questions with reference to the European Union. And I thought that since we are all beneficiaries of the of support by the European Union's, we're somehow being supported by the European Initiative on Human Rights and Democracy, and the development of our activities is actually coming directly out of this kind of an action plan on human rights and democracy. And I thought it would be interesting for us to take a look at this and in an open-minded but also critical perspective and see what is it. How does the European Union see itself as an actor on the global stage? And how do we see our partnership with this project that the European Union is articulating? I think this is something that, in fact, we should all do in this global campus context, because it's a way of both taking stock of who are we and what are we doing, what is our relationship with our primary donor, but it's also a way of giving candid, open, and potentially critical feedback to our primary donor in ways that in fact might be welcome and useful. So I'm not introducing the European Union perspective as a way of whatever sort of cheerleader, a way of just rallying and mobilizing support and this kind of thing. I think it's more a sober, critical reflection, and that's also why I'm intent on doing this in the framework of different expressions of human rights skepticism. So are there aspects of the European Union's policies on human rights that could be vulnerable to or subject to skeptical analysis and response? One way of coming at this, and I apologize for sort of jumping a little bit between different slides, but this is just to start. I'll do this little patchwork of references. I thought it might be interesting to remind you, and for some of you maybe it's not so familiar, just what kind of an entity is the European Union? What is it all about? How does it conceive itself? Most of you probably know that the European Union was born as a free trade organization. It was born as a common market, as a space for free movement of capital goods and services. When my country, Denmark, joined the European Union in 1973, we in fact joined the European Common Market. That's what we voted for, and that's what we joined. And that's what existed at the time. In recent decades, the European Union has evolved from a free trade organization into a political union, a political entity, and it has very much sought to define itself as what it calls, in its own language, a community of values. So the emergence of the European Union as a community of values is often said to start with the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, where Article F says that the Union shall respect fundamental rights as guaranteed by the European Convention for Human Rights and as they result from the constitutional traditions common to the member states. A few years later, this is expanded in the Treaty of Amsterdam from 1997, where the value base of the European Union now is articulated as principles of liberty, democracy, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law. And again, we're told that these are principles that result from the constitutional traditions common to the member states. So here, the language is more explicit. It says the Union is founded on the following principles or the following values. There is another treaty in 2000 called the Treaty of Nice, but we skip forward to now 2007, where we have the Treaty of Lisbon, which is very much like a constitution for the European Union. And again, we see that the values that provide the foundation for the European Union are further elaborated. The Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. These values are common to the member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. So we now have a wider value base again, which is the foundation of the European Union. Article 6 of the Lisbon Treaty gives this legal definition and in fact makes reference to the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which now has the same value as the treaty, so it's now primary law of the European Union. And this is a very significant development for Europe. Before we get to Article 6, however, there's Article 3 in the Lisbon Treaty, which is the one I mainly wanted to point to in this connection. In its relations with the wider world, the Union shall uphold and promote its values and interests and contribute to the protection of its citizens. It shall contribute to peace, security, and sustainable development of the earth, solidarity, mutual respect among peoples, free and fair trade, eradication of poverty, and the protection of human rights, in particular rights of a child, as well as the strict observance of the development of international law, including respect for principles of the United Nations Charter. This all sounds fine and well, but it's maybe worth pausing for a second. In its relations with the wider world, the Union shall uphold and promote its values. So the Article 3 says explicitly, we expect a value-based, proactive foreign policy on the part of the European Union. And that's the kind of policy that's being elaborated and fleshed out in documents such as the strategy and action plan that I was flashing on the screen a moment ago. This is a realization of Article 3 of the Lisbon Treaty. The European Initiative for Democracy and Human Rights is a realization of Article 3 of the Lisbon Treaty, and the Global Campus of Human Rights, in a certain sense, is an implementation, realization of Article 3 of the Lisbon Treaty. And my question really today is, how comfortable are we with that? Is this a welcome context within which to elaborate this kind of academic cooperation in the area of human rights education? Or is there an element somehow of, I don't know what we want to call it, value export, Eurocentrism, hegemonic politics and international relations and so on? And if we remember some of the political points of skepticism that we heard about just a moment ago, questions of whether there is a certain bias in terms of maintaining status quo, unequal relations in the world, is the European Union somehow invested in that in ways that it is not completely open and explicit about, you know? So I wanted to put these kind of questions out there on the table, and I would very much also invite you to reflect and to think and give your responses and feedback. Maybe could we pause for a moment and just ask if there's any immediate reactions or thoughts to this question in the room? How do you see the EU aspiration as articulated in Article 3 of the Lisbon Treaty? Is there anyone who wants to venture? No? No? Okay. I'll try then to give some thoughts of my own on this question, and also to take the intention of the class that we started in the afternoon a step forward. And in doing so, you'll have to indulge me. I have a background in philosophy, and I'm going to take a few minutes to reconstruct certain philosophical paradigms as a reference point for how we interpret these kind of endeavors that we're looking at. So to have a sort of framework for evaluation and potential critique. So I'm going to talk for a moment about social contract theory and how we conceptualize and construct a social contract related to human rights. And I'm sure some of this is fairly familiar to you, but nevertheless, I hope it will help to get some of the key questions into focus. So what does the social contract theory say? It says, in the beginning was what? In the beginning was anarchy, chaos, state of nature, as the social contract theorists say. It's this kind of undefined, chaotic state of nature, which is characterized by a war of all against all, survival of the fittest, and as Hobbes said, life is nasty, brutish, and short. So to compensate for the primarily existential insecurity and lack of welfare in the state of nature, people decide, so the social contract theory says, which is kind of like a story or a tale, a myth. It says people decide to enter into a civilized state, social state, and they do that by establishing a sovereign power that governs people. And how does the sovereign power govern people? In the social contract theory as it evolves, the sovereign power governs by rule of law. So the social contract is in effect the story of how society emerges that's governed by rule of law in such a way that law is applicable to all citizens equally. So the rule of law positions citizens. In the original social contract theory, they're called subjects. But the rule of law positions members of society in a horizontal relation with each other. We're equal before the law. In that sense, we're equal, and the law applies equally to all of us, which is, of course, not historically accurate. Modern constitutional democracies, modern societies evolved out of hierarchical societies where law applied differently to different members of society, to different social groups. The social contract theory, so to say, forgets all of that and postulates an origin of society where people are positioned in a horizontal relation with each other, equally vis-a-vis one another in face of the law. Social contract theory evolves over centuries, distinguishing, for example, between the legislative, the judiciary, and the executive powers. So the sovereign, the concept of the sovereign becomes a differentiated concept with checks and balances. And as we know, there's versions of social contract theory that, especially with Rousseau and onwards, that see the sovereign power as an expression of the popular will. So that the sovereign power is elected by the people and expresses the popular will and governs by rule of law. What does all of this have to do with human rights? You could ask, why am I talking about this in the present context? It has something to do with human rights because, as various philosophers have pointed out, especially in this regard, I'm very much inspired by the German moral and legal philosopher and political philosopher Jürgen Habermas. He says, rule of law comes under question mark. The modern society, governed in this way by rule of law, generates a question about the validity or legitimacy of law. Immanuel Kant says something similar in this regard. He says, it's not enough that law functions by being coercive. It's not enough that we obey the law because we fear the consequences of not doing so. Law must always be possible to comply with the law out of respect. It must be possible to respect the law. If we can respect the law, we can give it to ourselves, and that allows us to be autonomous, self-legislating. So the whole point is that modern society requires a legitimation or a justification of law, and the question arises, on what grounds does law by which society is ruled establish itself as legitimate? Habermas says there's two sources of legitimacy of law in the modern context, in modern society, or in early modern society. And one context is what he calls a higher law, a source of authority that is external to society itself. This could be conceived of as divine will, or it could be conceived of as natural nature. So a set of natural prescripts or religiously founded prescripts that determine the legitimacy of law. Law is legitimate insofar as it's in conformity with these sets of higher standards, higher principles, what is in the philosophical tradition called natural law. And the other source of legitimacy, as Habermas sees it, is the exercise of popular sovereignty, whereby a populace governs itself through democratic elections and legislative procedures and so on. So you have the exercise of public sovereignty on the one hand, and this principle, in fact, Habermas calls private autonomy, because it is a set of principles that essentially safeguards the integrity of the member of society, of the human person, who is part of society. Now, modern or contemporary human rights in the post-World War II era, has very much understood itself along this line of a social contract of this nature. So if you were to ask people like Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin and the rest of the people who are drafting the Universal Declaration, ask them, what are we doing? We're articulating in a contemporary idiom this idea of a higher law that is that establishes a standard of legitimacy for constitutional law at national level in all members of the international community. So we're giving articulation to this age-old, long-standing idea of natural law or higher law in a contemporary mode, in a contemporary form. We see the same kind of thing in the preambles to the various human rights treaties that make reference to natural law language. The self-evidence of human rights principles, for example, as a classical natural law idiom, is repeated in an undeniable in these kind of issues. You cannot rationally deny principles of this type. Are standard tropes of Enlightenment natural law thinking that carry over into the human rights treaties of the second half of the 20th century. Okay. Now, looking at this model of how to conceptualize or how to understand human rights, if we put human rights up here as an expression in a contemporary era of this idea about how to legitimize law, if that is how we interpret conceptually, structurally, the concept of human rights, we will immediately see a number of ambiguities, of points of difficulty or question, you know. And let me just mention 2 or 3 or 4 of them. One ambiguity is this real? Does it exist or not? And the ontological voices of skepticism, the Alistair McIntyre, the Jeremy Bentham, or others who say human rights are nonsense upon stilts. The idea of human rights is one, the belief in human rights is one with the belief in unicorns and witches. They do not exist. What they're basically doing is they're targeting a metaphysical conception of human rights like this one as pre-existing, timeless, and universal, and saying it's a fantasy, it's a fiction, it's not real. So the ontological criticisms of human rights target exactly this kind of a conception, and so do, to a very large extent, the culture-based voices of skepticism that we've heard about. They will say this kind of articulation of divine will, or natural law, or higher law, are in effect a projection of a secular interest, of secular beliefs, ideas, and values. And so what is framed as something that's timeless and universal is in reality demasked, unmasked as an expression of particular interests in one way or another. That's the same as virtually any other critique of metaphysics, you know, which is why legal positivism emerges as a doctrine that says there is no such thing, there's only the immanence of law and society and nothing beyond that. You know? So this is, so to place human rights up here is to make human rights vulnerable to both metaphysical or anti-metaphysical and cultural criticisms of different kinds. Right? Thirdly, to place human rights up here establishes human rights in a position of externality vis-a-vis social governance. And so the political skepticism that says that human rights establishes a parameter of undue interference with popular sovereignty exercise is exactly generated by this kind of separation of the human rights standard from the societal context in which it functions and operates. And I think this is something to be aware of and beware of, the problems associated with an externality of human rights standards vis-a-vis society. Of course, one doesn't need to exaggerate the externality, because as I was trying to say, the social contract itself is premised on common interest of citizens. The common interest of citizens is to ensure a certain respect for and safeguarding of dignity of the individual person. So one could somehow see how these higher standards are derived from the needs of society itself, but this is not well articulated in international, in the philosophy of human rights in this mode, in natural law theory. So the human rights come to appear as an externally imposed standard, which is sometimes being resisted by political entities at the local level in various ways. Moreover, a further problem with this way of conceptualizing rights is that, well, before I say the problem, I'll say a good thing about it, right? The sort of most important gain by this model, this conceptual model, is, despite the weakness, the level of transcendence that it involves. It establishes an normative basis by which to be critical about the exercise of power in society. So, if you didn't have such a transcendent normative basis, it's difficult to say why should a certain government, a certain social organization respect certain rights of individual persons. If we want to say Saudi Arabia ought to respect gender equality in a way that the country doesn't do it now, on what basis do we base that normative judgment that something ought to be different from how it is in reality? If there is no source of normativity outside of the existing social arrangement, it's very hard to say this is wrong. Things ought to be different somehow. So one could argue that a radical positivistic legal perspective has difficulties in establishing a basis of resistance, a basis of criticism of the status quo of given social arrangements. But the platform from which social conditions are being criticized is in many ways vulnerable itself to skeptical reactions. Right? And then finally, one further potential difficulty with this model is it's very hard if one accepts, even if one accepts the natural law, human rights, conceptual structure or framework, it's very hard to make sense of why should every nation and country in the world share the same interpretation, the same vision of the type of higher law standards that occupy this position. So why should we have one conception of this that is worldwide, that is global? Of course, if we say it's an expression of divine will, because there's only one divine being, then there's only one right answer to how society should be governed. But the world is not in agreement about this. So one could say, why not allow for distinct interpretations of what counts as legitimate human rights standards that are operational in different parts of the world? You could have an Asian interpretation, you could have a, Northern European, you could have a Sub-Saharan African, or whatever. You could have different religion-based interpretations, and you could say, why not just accept many different articulations of what counts as these kind of fundamental rights principles or higher law principles. Some countries might think that they got it right. They know what is what are the right these right higher principles. And an example of that, and I'm saying this without any malice, but nevertheless, an example of that is you would say the United States self-conception is very much a country that's blessed by being endowed with a constitution that respects a set of higher principles that are firmly enshrined in the Constitution, unchangeable, and that create prosperity in society. That limits for governance and create prosperity in society. And the idea is, because this political arrangement is so successful and so effective, we would be happy to share it with others. And so you see yourself, you see international relations as a matter of somehow exporting a model of success that has worked in one part of the world to other places in other parts of the world. We've seen America do this in a very responsible way from a European perspective after World War II through Marshall Aid and so on. Much less successful, for example, in recent developments in the Arab Gulf, for example, where the attempt to export democracy and human rights through coercive means miserably failed. But the idea that international relations becomes a matter of exporting a formula that is functional and seen to be metaphysically founded. Is it okay? You're okay. Now I want to give you a second story about the social contract. And for those of you who study philosophy, and maybe the rest of you, you're already familiar with this, but I'll just very quickly recapitulate. The story of the social contract number 2, right? This was number 1. And social contract number 2, I'll just get rid of this tongue up here. Second articulation focuses not on a particular society, but rather on a globe, a world order, that, of course I could have drawn this better, but it doesn't really matter, that is inhabited by many states or many different societies. The social contract number 2 says in the beginning was a state of nature, not inside societies, but between societies. So relations between societies are characterized by war of all against all, power of the mighty, conquest and abuse, and whatever else there might be. And of course, this is historically accurate. These thoughts were developed in the 17th and 18th century in European philosophy with reference to this notion of perpetual peace, which saw itself expressly as a second-generation social contract theory, and that took its point of departure in the observation that nations are fundamentally and typically and historically at war with each other. And that's to the detriment of all. That's the idea of the perpetual peace, that it destroys, it jeopardizes both security and welfare, well-being inside societies to be perpetually at war with one another. And the theoreticians of perpetual peace say that what seems to be peace in this state of nature between nations or between peoples is in reality not a true peace but just a truce. It's a temporary ceasefire waiting to prepare the way for another conquest, another attack. And this takes the form even of nations and states capturing each other as colonies or each other's populations as slaves. So the state of nature knows no limits in regard to potential violation and abuse. And the theoreticians of perpetual peace ask themselves, what can we do to reverse this situation, to create a situation where, so to go from a situation where conflict is the norm and peace is the exception temporarily, to say that peace is the norm, peaceful relations is the norm, and conflict is the exception that has to be then addressed and rebalanced and so on. That's the project of the theory of perpetual peace. And what is the answer? It's exactly the same as in the first social contract theory, establishing rule of law. Right? So the perpetual peace says we can establish civilized international relations between peoples and between states, by establishing rule of law at international level. Right? So the theories of perpetual peace are the context in which, or emerge in the same time, the same context, as the origin of international law theory, as a remedy against hostile and conflictual relations among people. Now we have to ask the question, the answer is international law, what form does international law take? How does international law function? What does it look like? And the theoreticians of perpetual peace start by focusing on a very simplified classical expression of international law as reciprocal bilateral relationships between princes, they call it, but between sovereign representatives of autonomous nations. Bilateral, reciprocal international law that's typically self-executing. So, for example, trade law. We will allow your goods into our territory without tariffs, on the understanding that you allow our goods into your territory without tariffs. We will allow you to set up a diplomatic representation in our capital city on the understanding we can do the same, and so on. So there is this kind of reciprocity built into classical international law, and it's self-executing in the sense that if you start to impose tariffs on our goods, then we'll impose tariffs on your goods. And if you kick out our diplomats and suspect them of being spies, then we'll kick out yours, and we'll say for sure that they're also spies, right? And this is the kind of way that many dimensions or aspects of international law fundamentally works. And we're all familiar with this. The theoreticians of perpetual peace had the idea that in addition to the self-execution of international law, there should be some kind of regional organizations or global organizations that would have a power to intervene. So that if there was a transgression of international law by one party, for example, a use of force or violence, it wouldn't just be that the other would retaliate, but that you would create international organizations that would maintain and uphold the basic principles and rules of international law, very much a blueprint for how we've seen the world develop in the post-World War II era with the formation of global and regional organizations based exactly on this idea of creating peace and prosperity for peoples of the world, right? So this is the whole project, and in many ways, these ideas that come from the 17th and 18th centuries have somehow come into their own and flourished in the 20th century and onwards in different regions of the world. Now, later scholars of perpetual peace, and especially Immanuel Kant, the German sort of cornerstone of much modern philosophy, questioned the articulation of international law simply as reciprocal and bilateral, or extended bilateral. It could be extended, of course, in a multilateral framework, but always based on this core conception of international law. And a scholar like Kant said, we have to think again, because not only are we citizens of a particular country of the world, a particular nation of the world, we also at the same time have to see ourselves as citizens of the globe. So we have to adopt a cosmopolitan perspective, not just a state perspective or a national identity, but in addition to that, together with that, a cosmopolitan perspective. We have to see ourselves as citizens of the globe. Why? Because Kant started to see what is now evident to all of us 200 years later. This is 1795. Kant wrote his famous treaty on perpetual peace, and he started to see the early traits and signs of what we today call globalization. He started to see the interdependency of states and peoples. He said because the world is a globe, it's small, we can't infinitely expand, so we have to learn to tolerate each other's company. Somehow, he was saying, He was talking about how problems facing people in one part of the world, in fact, cannot be necessarily effectively solved alone at national level. In a contemporary perspective, we see borders not as firm, but as shot through with holes, pores, ways that they can be permeated and so on. So you take many of the issues that face people in the world today. Let's take, for example, health issues. Viruses do not respect borders. Viruses cross borders and they can move very, very quickly from one end of the globe to another. So effective health policies need somehow not only to safeguard particular national interests against other national interests, but at the same time need to adopt a global perspective. We are all citizens of one planet that has to come to terms with this together. Climate change obviously is a very good example of that as well. Carbon emissions do not respect borders, but people in the small countries somewhere in the midst of the Indian Ocean are enormously vulnerable to impacts that originate from other parts of the world, for example. And all the islands might sink because of carbon emissions in Europe and the United States, for example, or other things like this. So you start to see there's a need for thinking of international law not just in a bilateral, realistic perspective where you're actually negotiating self-interest, but also in a cosmopolitan, idealistic perspective to some degree. And in fact, the dichotomy between realism and idealism vanishes because you cannot safeguard national self-interest effectively without also adopting a global perspective on many of the issues that face humanity in the world today. I talked about health, I talked about the environment, but one could also talk about the economy. Economic developments in one part of the world immediately create unemployment in other parts of the world and affect people and well-being and livelihoods in other parts of the world. Security issues in one part of the world transcend borders, and wars that are being fought out in Syria between Iran and Saudi Arabia are affecting stability of the entire European continent, for example. With matters of quite fast and direct impact. What Kant said in his essay on perpetual peace was we need to think of law at three levels. Constitutional law, which governs the rule of law at national level, international law in the classical reciprocal bilateral fashion, and thirdly, what he calls cosmopolitan law. And he says we have to think of world citizen rights, Weltbürgerrechte, or cosmopolitan rights, could say. So we see ourselves as members both of a particular nation and of the human family in the world. And we have to conceptualize, we're only able to tackle the problems that face humanity in an interdependent, globalized world order if we conceptualize cosmopolitan rights as a third level of primary law, primary legislation. Now, the difference between, if we see this as another blueprint, as an alternative blueprint for how to conceptualize contemporary human rights, I started out by saying that the drafters of the Universal Declaration, they thought of human rights within this kind of paradigm, with this kind of framework. Just a few decades later, there's nothing to prevent us from interpreting and seeing human rights in this kind of framework as an attempt to articulate core principles of the common interest of globalized society governing and regulating itself. Right? So the idea is that you have a reflexive problem of the international community that identifies issues and tries to articulate norms in the common interest of the international community as a supplementary level to the bilateral negotiation of self-interest of particular countries and peoples. And that you need all three levels. We need a level, so just as we need international climate law, which cannot be negotiated simply in a realistic way of us asserting our interest against yours. We're somehow all in the same sinking boat together, right? The same kind of thing with other levels of cosmopolitan law, cosmopolitan rights. And I think that like Kant starts to conceptualize human rights in this way, as part of a common project in a globally interdependent world. The difference in this regard is that you need to create, there's new challenges that emerge. You cannot simply say we're exporting our idea of what is right and wrong in the world to other parts of the world. You don't have an external source of authority that tells you these are the true values, this is what is right and wrong. What you're doing is, in fact, you're reflecting on your processing historical experience. And if we want to interpret human rights within this kind of a framework, we see human rights not as timeless and metaphysically anchored, but as time-bound and historically determined by the kind of experience that peoples of the world have confronted and have set up a sign saying, it's not acceptable, never again, nunca más, whatever you might want to say, you know. It's a processing of historical experience. The way the experience of the slave trade was being processed in the 18th century, the way in which exploitation in the newly developed industrial plants was processed in the 19th century, the way in which the experience of colonialism has been processed in the 20th century, and the experience of the Holocaust and so on. So our friend from our sister program in Pretoria, Christoph Heinz, who's one of the eminent human rights scholars of our time, as a sort of side project to much of the other work he was doing, developed at a certain point in time something called the struggle theory of human rights. Struggle theory of human rights, which is exactly trying to do that, to anchor human rights in contemporary struggles and contemporary historical experience, saying every right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or in the international human rights framework is the flip side of a struggling cause, a fighting cause. It's something people have been rising to, have been wanting to fight for and risk their lives to defend and to protect, with resonance in the wider international community. So this sort of model of how to conceptualize human rights anchors human rights in historical experience, in context of historical interdependencies, and insists on two premises that are very important, I think. One premise is a premise of accountability. Every member of the international community is accountable to other members of the international community for its compliance with the fundamental standards. Why? Because these arise from common challenges and issues of common concern. So the doctrine of the Vienna Declaration of Human Rights that we talked about in the afternoon, that says the compliance with international human rights law is a legitimate concern of the international community. Sovereignty is not excused, right? Why is that? Because we are in the same thinking boat together, right? Because these are issues of fundamental common concern. Similarly, this kind of a framework requires that the different parties in the international community, members of the family of nations, have some sort of equal say in the articulation of the norms that are articulated in common and that are binding in common. So there's a test of whose experience counts, of who and whose voice is being heard in the bodies that are articulating and negotiating these kind of standards. I have a quote from just try to find it very quickly. I have a quote from the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas that talks exactly along these lines. You know, I made a few quotes from Habermas on exactly these kind of issues. Habermas says at one point, he says, human rights standards stem less from the particular cultural background of Western civilization than from the attempt to answer specific questions posed by social modernity, global interdependency, that in the meantime has covered the globe. He says the key challenge is to supply an interpretation of human rights that does justice to the modern world from the viewpoint of other cultures or other people, as well as our own. So it's not so much a question of sort of pre-existing primordial values and which values have been articulated in a set of abstract metaphysical standards. It's a question of actual dynamics in international norm setting in the contemporary interdependent world. And what are those dynamics like? Are they equitable? Are there inequalities, dominations, vested interests that are somehow being superimposed on the attempt to define a common agenda? And now, going back to my initial question, and I'm aware that time is running out, I would like to suggest that for better and for worse, the European Union is trying to project itself as exponent of this kind of a conception of human rights at international level. Right? I would like to say the European Union sees itself as member of both regional and global intergovernmental structures and organizations that are respecting principles of multilateralism and that are striving towards principles of equity in multilateral relations, that are insisting on accountability structures in the way in which human rights and other issues of international concern are being managed and developed. And I think if we were to read in detail, and I think we don't need to do that now, but I had actually I looked at some of the key issues of the human rights strategy and program of action of the European Union, current one, as well as the development cooperation strategy, and one finds very, very strong echoes of this kind of a vision of a global international order that is premised on developing structures of accountability and inclusiveness. Part of what the European Union is aware of in its policy documents is that in order to maintain a credible voice in this regard, it needs to do a number of things that are key themes in its strategic planning documents. One thing is it has to ensure coherence between internal and external policies. So whatever is being sort of established as international relations policies have to also be effectively implemented at regional and national level. There has to be coherence. One is to practice what one preaches, so to say. There has to also be coherence between different policy objectives. It doesn't work if you have one set of human rights norms that are being applied in the external relations, and then you have a whole different agenda, for example, in your trade policies, that are undermining the ability to comply with human rights. And remarkably, the European Union is very, very aware and attentive to this in its policy and strategic documents. It also talks about the importance of developing respectful, reciprocal bilateral partnerships and then carrying over bilateral partnerships of this nature into the multilateral arena so as to strengthen multilateral governance, not just in a polarizing way in the world, but rather in the manner of creating thematic constructive constellations. And I think, for example, what you were saying from the outset, Veronica, about the long legacy of multilateral commitments by Latin American states makes for a natural partnership between the European Union and Latin American countries. And I think that has existed and continues to exist in many ways as a common commitment to this kind of a conception of international relations. I think that the EU policy documents, in my view, are very impressive. I think they're extremely well drafted, and I encourage you to read them. And I think they're very promising. I think what they do, in fact, is they establish a standard by which the European Union opens itself up for critical evaluation. Are they really realizing these policies in practice? And I don't think they always are. I think if you look at the EU security policies, energy policies, and not least trade policies, you'll see the way in which the European Union is, for example, protecting patent rights in the WTO is not necessarily fully compliant with the kind of human rights agendas that they are articulating in the strategic documents that we see here. And they're actually saying we are willing to be held accountable to these standards of policy consistency, for example. I think it's a very, very big statement. It's a very big promise. I don't know very many other international actors that are putting themselves on the line to that degree as the European Union are, so they're also opening themselves up to constructive criticism. And my idea is that in this context, and in general in the context of the global campuses, we should take them up on that invitation. And we should actually try to say, these are the overall policy principles that you're committed to. Let's see if you're really delivering in practice. And there will be cases where it's not. So I think this is where I would pause and maybe invite, I don't know if it went too fast, but I hope that there's at least a certain element of sort of main ideas that stick. How do we conceptualize human rights as two fundamentally both related and different concepts? I think we need elements of both, actually. But I think it's very important to have the cosmopolitan perspective in the picture if we want to make sense of contemporary human rights. And it's also very important in a world now where we're starting to hear about America first or Europe first or whatever else it might be. It's very important to be reminded that there are certain kinds of issues that simply cannot be effectively addressed in this kind of a policy framework of thinking that you can assert national interest without taking account of the wider global system of integrity. Okay, pause here.